The wind moved like a whisper across the Montana plains, brushing through the dry grass that caught the last light of day. Somewhere beneath that vast, endless sky rode a man named Cole Tanner, one of the last true cowboys left in the American West. His hat was worn, his boots cracked, his horse, old but loyal, to the world beyond these hills. Men like Cole were just ghosts of a forgotten past. But out here, on the open trail, his story was still being written. What no one knew was that Cole carried with him a box of letters, old, yellowed, and bound with a piece of faded blue ribbon. Letters no one ever received. Letters written to a woman who stopped waiting long ago. The night before winter's first snow, Cole stopped beside a dying campfire and opened one of those letters. His voice trembled as he read the words aloud. "If you're reading this, then I didn't make it back in time." The words vanished into the dark, swallowed by the wind. He folded it again carefully and tucked it close to his chest, as if the paper itself carried his heartbeat. There was something about the cowboy life that outsiders never saw: the loneliness, the silence, the weight of memory. Cole wasn't just riding for work, he was riding to forget. But the land remembers everything. Every hoofbeat on that empty prairie echoed a story long buried of love, regret, and promises broken under the same sky that never forgets. And as the stars spread across the heavens, Cole Tanner's past began to stir. The next morning would bring more than just daylight. It would bring a ghost from the world he left behind. What if the letters you never sent could find their way home after all? Stay with this story to the end, because somewhere between the trails and the thunder, a man will learn that not all roads lead away forever. If you love quiet, soulful stories from America's forgotten heartland, hit subscribe and join us on this journey through dust, sky, and memory. The first light crept across the prairie, painting the frost-tipped grass in gold. Cole rubbed his hands together, the warmth of the fire long gone, and stared eastward toward the horizon, where the land met the sky in a thin line of pale blue. His horse, Dusty, snorted softly, as if to remind him the day had begun. Cole tightened his saddle straps, glanced once more at the folded letters in his saddlebag, and whispered, "Just one more delivery, old friend." He wasn't lying entirely. There was a delivery, but it wasn't cattle or mail this time. It was closure. Somewhere in the small town of Willow Bend, a name still haunted the church records: Clara Monroe. She was the one he wrote to, the one he left when the railroad came calling. He could still remember the day he left, the whistle screaming through the valley, her hand trembling as she gave him the ribbon that now held the letters together. He promised her it'd be just a few months. It turned into 20 years. The wind rose and carried the scent of sagebrush. A hawk circled above, and Cole felt something stir a memory too heavy to name. He reached the ridge and looked down at the empty valley. It used to be full of life: cattle, cowhands, laughter, and the Sunday bell echoing from the church. Now it was just wind and silence. Cole dismounted, knelt, and ran his hand through the dirt. "It all ends where it began," he murmured. Then he saw it, a small wooden post, half buried in the soil, marked with his family's old cattle brand. Someone had been here before him, someone who still remembered. As the sun rose higher, he felt the weight of time pressing down. He knew that soon he'd have to face what he'd avoided for half a lifetime: the truth behind those letters, and the reason he never sent them. That night, as campfire smoke rose toward the cold stars, a stranger's shadow appeared at the edge of the light, a young drifter, no more than 20. "You, Cole Tanner?" the boy asked. "Been looking for you. Got something that belongs to you." Cole's hand froze on the coffee pot. The boy reached into his coat and pulled out a single letter opened, addressed in Clara's handwriting. The cowboy's breath caught. The mountain wind fell silent. And for the first time in 20 years, Cole Tanner was afraid not of death, but of the truth written in that forgotten hand. The letter trembled in Cole's weathered hands. The ink was faded, but his name was clear as day. The boy said he'd found it in an abandoned farmhouse outside Willow Bend. He'd been helping a rancher tear it down when the letter fell from a cracked cedar chest. It had never been mailed. Cole couldn't speak. The fire popped, scattering sparks into the cold air. Finally, he said, "You read it." The boy shook his head. "Figured it wasn't mine to read." Cole nodded. Respect like that was rare. "Much obliged," he said softly. The boy tipped his hat and melted back into the dark, leaving Cole alone with the ghosts of his past. He hesitated before opening it. Part of him wanted to burn it, to let the past rest beneath the ash. But another part, the part that had kept writing letters for 2 decades, needed to know. The paper crackled as he unfolded it. The handwriting was delicate, familiar. "Cole, if this reaches you, know that I waited longer than I should have. Life moves different out here. Seasons turn, rivers change course, but the heart doesn't forget. I'm not angry anymore. I just hope you found what you were looking for." Cole read it again and again until the words blurred. He'd left her thinking he'd come back rich enough to buy land and a future. But the world had changed faster than he could ride. Railroads, towns, new men with clean boots and soft hands. There was no place left for cowboys like him. He folded the letter gently, then placed it inside his saddlebag with the rest. But this one was different. This one was an ending. The next morning, Cole turned his horse toward Willow Bend. The road ahead was long, the air colder now. Somewhere in the valley below, the church bell would soon toll for Sunday service, and he wondered if the wind might carry his name through town one last time. Cole rode through the long valley where the air tasted like rain and dust. The trail to Willow Bend wound between low ridges and brittle sagebrush, and every hoofbeat felt like a countdown to something he wasn't ready to face. The sky stretched wide blue in some places, bruised gray in others, and the clouds looked like ghosts drifting west. He kept thinking of Clara's letter, of the softness in her words. She had forgiven him. That should have brought peace, but it only made the ache sharper. By midday, he reached the fork where the old stagecoach road met the newer rail line. Once, that railroad had been his reason for leaving. They needed riders to guide the freight, men who could brave the wild country and guard the shipments. It was supposed to be 1 year's work. He thought he'd return with enough to buy land, to build her the porch she dreamed of. Instead, he rode farther and farther, chasing pay and purpose until both slipped away. At a small creek, he stopped to water Dusty. The horse bent its neck to drink while Cole splashed cold water on his face. He caught his reflection in the ripple's sun-creased eyes, a beard more gray than brown, the look of a man half-carved from the trail itself. He whispered, "Don't reckon she'd recognize me now." That night, he camped near the old bridge outside Carson Hollow. It was the same bridge he'd crossed 20 years earlier when he'd left Clara behind. The boards were cracked now, half the rails missing. The moonlight poured through the gaps like silver smoke. He could almost see the wagon she'd been sitting on that day, her hands folded tight, the blue ribbon fluttering in the wind. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in decades, he spoke her name out loud. Clara, Clara. The sound of it echoed down the canyon and came back softer, like the mountain itself was whispering it back. When dawn came, a storm brewed on the horizon. Cole saddled up and pushed forward. He didn't know who was still in Willow Bend, whether she was alive, whether anyone would even remember his name, but he knew he couldn't turn back again. By afternoon, the rain started falling hard. Lightning clawed the sky. Dusty stumbled on the slippery trail, and Cole had to lead him by the reins. Just as he reached higher ground, he saw a shape through the sheets of rain, a small cabin, smoke rising from its chimney. He knocked once. A voice inside called, "Come in before you drown, stranger." Cole stepped into the warmth, shaking off the rain. An old man sat by the stove, patching a saddle. His eyes squinted. "Well, I'll be, if it ain't Cole Tanner." Cole froze. The voice was familiar, gravelly, older, but steady. Eli Dawson." The man grinned. "Ain't many left to remember, but yeah, that's me." Cole smiled for the first time in years. "Didn't think anyone out here still knew me." Eli chuckled. "Hard to forget the man who used to break wild broncs bareback for fun." They laughed, but behind it lingered something heavier, the passage of time neither could deny. Eli poured coffee and said, "Word was, you headed east and never came back." Clara waited. For a long while, she did. Cole stared into the cup. "She's still in town." Eli sighed. "Town's smaller now. She moved out by the old mill after her PA passed. Married for a spell. Widow now. Teaches Sunday school." The coffee turned bitter in Cole's mouth. "Guess I'm 20 years too late." Eli set his cup down gently. "Maybe not too late for words, friend. Sometimes they matter more after the dust's settled." The storm passed by morning, leaving the world washed clean and shining. The smell of wet earth filled the air as Cole and Eli saddled their horses. Eli insisted on riding with him part way to town. The two men rode in silence, the only sound the creak of leather and the rhythmic clop of hooves on damp earth. "So," Eli said finally, "you come all this way just to see her?" Cole nodded. "I don't even know what I'd say." 20 years of silence don't leave much room for speeches. Eli smiled faintly. "Then don't talk, just be there. Sometimes presence says more than words." When they reached the ridge overlooking Willow Bend, Cole stopped. Below him lay a town smaller than he remembered, just a scatter of buildings, a white steeple, a few smoke trails rising into the crisp morning air. It used to feel like the center of the world. Now it looked like a memory left out in the sun. As they descended, familiar sights came into view. The saloon where laughter used to spill into the street, the livery stable where he and Eli worked side by side, the general store, with its porch swing still hanging by one chain. Every corner carried a ghost. They tied their horses outside the diner. The bell jingled as Cole pushed the door open. The smell of bacon and fresh coffee hit him like a wave. A few heads turned faces older, slower, but still curious. Whispered voices followed. "That can't be Cole Tanner after all these years." A waitress approached, wiping her hands on her apron. "Sit anywhere you like, mister." Then she paused, squinting. "Wait, you're him, the cowboy from Clara's stories." Cole blinked. "She talked about me. The woman smiled. Every once in a while. Said you were the best rider in 3 counties, and the most stubborn fool she ever met. He chuckled softly. Sounds about right. After breakfast, Eli clapped him on the shoulder. You'll find her by the old mill road. She walks that way most afternoons. Cole hesitated. You reckon she even want to see me? Eli looked him square in the eye. Only one way to find out. As Cole rode out of town, the wind carried the smell of rain and wildflowers. The mill road stretched before him narrow, lined with cottonwoods, shedding golden leaves. Each step of his horse brought back 1,000 memories. Her laughter, her voice, her eyes, the color of stormlight. Then, ahead on the trail, he saw a figure walking slowly, a woman with silver hair tucked beneath a shawl, holding a basket of wildflowers. Cole's breath caught, time slowed. When she turned, her eyes met his, and for a moment the years between them fell away. Clara Monroe stopped in her tracks, the basket slipping slightly from her hands. The man before her looked older, thinner. The years etched deep into his face, but the eyes, those same steady eyes she remembered, were unchanged. Cole Tanner, she whispered, almost to herself. He removed his hat. Ma'am. For a moment neither spoke. The sound of wind through the cottonwoods filled the silence. Finally, she said, I thought I'd never see you again. I thought the same, he replied softly. Guess the trail wasn't done with me yet. They stood there, 2 lives that had gone separate ways, circling back to the same road. Clara gestured toward a bench near the stream. You look like you could use a rest. He smiled faintly. Been a long ride. They sat side by side, and for a while they didn't talk at all. Just the sound of water, wind, and the quiet pulse of memory between them. After a while, Clara said, I found your letters. Cole stiffened. You did. They came to me years later. A ranch hand found them when your old cabin burned down. Most were too charred to read, but I kept them anyway. He looked down. I kept writing, even when I knew they'd never reach you. It was the only way I could keep from disappearing. Clara's voice softened. I waited, Cole, maybe longer than I should have, but I never hated you. You were chasing something you thought mattered. He nodded, eyes glistening, and I lost what truly did. A long silence hung between them. Then Clara reached into her basket and handed him a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. This was yours. Never got the chance to give it back. He opened it. Inside was the same blue ribbon she'd tied around the first letter he ever wrote her. It still smelled faintly of lavender and dust. Cole's voice broke. Guess some things don't fade. Clara smiled gently. The wind changes, Cole. The heart doesn't always have to. They talked until the sun dipped low, sharing stories, filling in the spaces time had carved out. When the shadows stretched long, Cole finally said, I don't expect forgiveness. Clara placed a hand on his plexus. You already have it. For the first time in 20 years, Cole Tanner felt the weight lift, the burden of distance, of silence, of letters lost to time. The sky above them glowed orange and gold. Somewhere in the distance, the church bell rang, calling the town to evening service. Cole looked toward the sound and said quietly, Maybe it's time I found my way home. Clara nodded. Maybe it is. And as they walked back down that dusty trail, side by side, the wind whispered through the trees, soft, endless, forgiving. The next few days passed like a dream half remembered. Cole stayed in Willow Bend, sleeping in the small room above the livery where he and Eli once worked. The bed creaked, The walls smelled of cedar and oil, but it was warmer than any place he'd laid his head in years. Each morning he saddled Dusty and rode out to the mill road, where Clara tended her garden and watched the sun climb the hills. They spoke in fragments about the harvest, the town, the people who'd gone. There was no talk of the years in between, no heavy questions about what could have been, just the quiet understanding that both had survived the passing of time. One morning, Cole brought her a small wooden box. Inside lay a handful of letters tied with string, the ink faded, but still legible. "These made it," he said. "Found M in an old trunk after the fire." Clara ran her fingers across the pages. "You kept them. Couldn't burn what little I had left." She smiled faintly. "You always did hold on to things that hurt." Cole chuckled softly. "Reckon I'm trying to learn better." They sat beneath the cottonwood tree, the same one that had shaded them as kids. The wind hummed through the leaves, carrying that familiar low whistle that gave the town its name. "Do you ever wonder," Clara said, "what might have happened if you'd stayed?" Cole looked out across the valley. "All the time, but wondering don't change a thing. Maybe the trail had to take me the long way round, so I'd understand what really mattered." Clara nodded slowly. "The mountains teach that lesson. They make you climb slow so you don't forget what the ground feels like." For a moment, they just watched the river glint between the reeds. Time, it seemed, had softened the sharp edges between them. When Cole left that afternoon, she said, "You'll come back tomorrow." He tipped his hat. "If the wind's kind and the trail's clear, ma'am." That night, the stars spilled across the sky like silver dust. Cole lay awake, listening to the crickets, thinking of the roads he'd ridden and the one that still lay ahead. For the first time in years, he wasn't afraid of what tomorrow might bring. Autumn deepened, the hills turned gold, and the nights carried the bite of frost. Willow Bend began to prepare for Winter Harvest Festival, the final cattle drives, the slow hush that came before snow. Cole started helping around town again. He fixed fences, mended harnesses, and even rode with the younger hands, teaching them how to read the wind and steady their seat in the saddle. Folks began to greet him again, the whispers fading into nods of respect. Eli teased him one morning as they worked the corral. "Never thought I'd see the day you'd play school teacher to a bunch of greenhorns." Cole grinned. "Guess I had to do something with all the mistakes I made." The laughter came easy now. Even Dusty seemed lighter, trotting with a spring in his step. Every evening, Cole rode out to see Clara. They'd sit by the porch as the sun sank behind the ridges. She told him about her students, the hymns she still played on Sundays, the friends who'd gone, and the quiet she'd learned to live with. He listened, mostly. Sometimes she'd hum an old tune he half remembered from their youth. One evening, as the light faded, she asked, "Do you ever get tired of the silence?" He smiled. "No, ma'am. After all them years on the trail, I figure silence is the only thing that ever told me the truth." She tilted her head. "And what's it say now? That maybe the road's finally done running?" Clara's eyes softened. "Then maybe it's time to rest." The wind carried a smell of pine and distant smoke. Cole knew what she meant, not just rest for the night, but rest for the soul. The next morning, he rode into town early. The preacher had asked for help repairing the chapel roof before the first snow. As Cole worked high above the street, he could see the whole valley spread out before him, the trails, the river, the mill road, winding like a ribbon of gold. It looked peaceful, untouched by the restlessness that had driven him for so long. When the job was done, the preacher handed him a small wooden cross. "For the work," he said. Cole took it with a nod. "Don't figure I earned it." The preacher smiled. "Maybe not for what you've done, but for where you're going." That night, Cole placed the cross beside his bed. It wasn't religion, he'd found it was meaning. Winter arrived, quiet but steady. Snow blanketed the ridgetops, and smoke curled from chimneys all across Willow Bend. The world seemed smaller, gentler. Cole built a fire in the livery each morning, the warmth drawing in stray dogs and children with red noses. On Christmas Eve, Clara invited him to supper. The old mill house was lit by lanterns, the table covered in simple Fairstew biscuits, apple pie. When Cole stepped through the door, the scent of cinnamon and cedar nearly broke him. She smiled. It's been a long time since there was company at this table. He hung his hat by the door, glad to be the one breaking that streak. They ate slow, talking about small things, the weather, the schoolhouse, Eli's new grandchild. But beneath the words was something deeper, something fragile and warm. After dinner, Clara handed him a small, wrapped parcel. "Don't open it till morning," he grinned. "You always did." Snowflakes drifted under the lamplight, catching on his coat like silver ash. He stopped halfway down the road and looked back. Through the frosted window, he could see her silhouette by the fire, sewing quietly, the rhythm of her hands steady as ever. He whispered, "Merry Christmas, Clara." Back at the livery, he unwrapped the parcel, despite her warning. Inside was a small leather journal and a note in her neat handwriting. "You've spent your life writing letters that never found their way home. Maybe it's time to write one that does." Cole traced the words with his thumb. The pages were blank, waiting. He sat by the firelight and began to write, not about regret, but about gratitude. About the people he'd met, the miles he'd ridden, the woman who still believed he could change. For hours, he wrote until his hand cramped and the sky outside turned pale with dawn. When he finished, he closed the book and whispered, "That one's for you, Clara." The next day, he brought the journal to her porch. She was in tea, there just a small sprig of pine tied with blue ribbon hanging from the door handle. He smiled. "Guess she's still ahead of me." He tucked the journal into the mailbox, mounted Dusty, and rode toward the ridge. The morning sun painted the valley gold. Every trail, every turn, every breath felt like part of something whole at last. As he reached the crest, he turned back for one last look. The town shimmered in the light quiet, enduring, alive. And for the first time in 20 years, Cole Tanner felt at peace. The thaw came slowly that year. In February, the snow melted off the high trails first, trickling down into the gullies until the creeks began to sing again. Cole woke one morning to the sound of water against stone and realized the silence of winter had finally broken. Dusty stomped in his stall, impatient for the road, and Cole felt that same old tug-the-call of open country. Yet this time, it wasn't restlessness. It was something gentler, like a promise waiting to be kept. He spent the morning repairing his saddle, rubbing oil into the leather until it shone. Eli wandered in, chewing on a sprig of hay. "You ridin' out again?" he asked. "Just up the ridge," Cole said. "Need to see how the land's holdin' after the freeze." Eli nodded, then leaned on the stall door. "Funny thing, you coomin' back here. Folks say you've changed the place, mourned the weather." Cole laughed softly. "Don't know about that. Maybe the place changed me first." The trail was slick with mud and meltwater, but the air was clear as glass. From the ridge, the world spread wide fields, greening in the valley, mountains still capped in white, and Willow Bend lying quiet in between. He remembered how the land had looked when he was young, when he'd believed the horizon was something you could chase forever. Now he saw it differently. The horizon didn't move. It waited, patient as time. Halfway down the ridge, Cole found the old miner's cabin nearly buried in drift. He hadn't seen it since he was 20. Inside, dust lay thick on the table where men once played cards and drank cheap whiskey. He found an old tin cup, bent but unbroken, and held it up to the light. Somehow, it felt like a mirror scarred, used, still good for one more pour. He camped there that night, the fire cracking against the cold stones. The stars came out sharp and bright, the way they only do when the air is thin. He thought of Clara's journal, now filled with pages of words he hadn't shown anyone. Maybe one day he would. Maybe he'd leave it with her when the season turned. As he sat watching the flames dance, a coyote howled, far off. Dusty lifted his head but didn't move. Cole smiled. Ain't nothin' out there but memories, old boy. The next morning, he rode home under a pink dawn. The town was stirring smoke rising, roosters calling. When he passed the schoolhouse, Clara was already there, sweeping the steps. She looked up and waved, the broom in her hand glinting in the light. Cole tipped his hat. "Morning, ma'am." She smiled. "You're up early. Couldn't sleep." The ridge was callin'. Did it say anything worth hearin'? Just what I already knew. He dismounted, tied Dusty to the post, and handed her a small bundle. Inside was the old tin cup, polished clean. "Figured you might use this for flowers." Clara ran her fingers along the rim. "You kept finding beauty in ruins, didn't you?" "Guess I had to. It's what brought me back." That day, they walked together through town. People nodded as they passed farmers, shopkeepers, even the preacher. The town had made peace with its ghost, and so had Cole. By evening, the sun dipped low and painted the valley gold. Clara turned to him. "You think you'll ever leave again?" He looked toward the horizon and shook his head. "No, ma'am. I reckon the trails finally led me home." She smiled, the kind that came from deep inside. "Then you better stay for supper." He laughed. "Wouldn't miss it for the world." The wind shifted, carrying the smell of rain from the west. Spring was coming, and with it, the start of something new. Cole felt it in his bones, the quiet joy of a man who'd wandered long enough to understand that peace wasn't tea, a place you found. It was the place you stopped running from. That night, as thunder rumbled beyond the hills, Cole wrote one final line in his journal before the fire died low. "The mountains still whisper, but now they speak my name like home." Spring in Willow Bend arrived like a soft-spoken promise. The cottonwoods unfurled their first green leaves. The air smelled of wet soil and pine, and every creek came alive with song. Cole Tanner found himself working longer days, helping Eli mend fences and hauling lumber for the schoolhouse expansion Clara had dreamed up. Life, for once, seemed to unfold without haste. The days had rhythm work, laughter, supper, and the slow quiet of dusk. But peace, Cole learned, didn't mean the past stopped whispering. Some nights, when the wind turned cold, he'd wake to the echo of boots on dry trails, two voices calling from canyons he'd long left behind. He'd lie there staring at the rafters, listening to the old ache hum in his chest. It wasn't regret anymore, it was memory finding its rightful place. One afternoon, while riding toward the north pasture, he met a young drifter, a boy no older than 20, thin as wire, and wearing boots 2 sizes too big. The boy waved him down. "Mister," he said, "you from town?" "Used to be," Cole answered, smiling. "Guess I am again." The boy looked relieved. "Heard there's work. I can handle stock, fix a fence, ain't askin' much." Cole studied him for a moment, the same hunger, the same restlessness he'd once worn like armor. "Name's Cole Tanner. What's yours?" "Luke." "Well, Luke, you ride with me. We'll find you something." Back in Willow Bend, Eli offered the boy a bunk and a hot meal. Clara sent over bread and stew, as she always did when newcomers arrived. That evening, as the 3 of them sat by the fire, Luke listened wide-eyed to stories of the early days, the cattle drives, the storms, the wild nights. Cole didn't glorify any of it. He spoke of the cold, the loneliness, the long silences between one sunrise and the next. When the boy finally asked, "Ain't you ever wanted to leave again?" Cole smiled. "Once I thought the road was freedom. Turns out freedom's what you build when you stop running." Luke nodded slowly. "Guess I got a ways to go before I learned that." Cole leaned forward. "Ain't no shame in learnin' slow, son. The trail's got a way of teachin' you when you're ready." That night, Cole wrote in his journal against something he'd begun to do daily. The young ride to escape the past, the old ride to understand it. He looked at the firelight dancing over the pages and thought of all the nights he'd written to no one. Now every word felt like it belonged somewhere. Days turned into weeks. The town came alive with laughter again, barn dances, market days, kids chasing dogs through the mud. Clara's schoolhouse grew busier, her laughter often echoing down the main road. Cole sometimes stood outside just to listen, the sound filling spaces he didn't know were empty. One evening, as the sun fell behind the western ridge, Clara found him sitting by the old bridge, tossing pebbles into the water. "You look like a man thinkin' too hard," she said. "Maybe, just wondering how many roads a man's got to travel before he figures out where he belongs." Clara sat beside him. "Maybe it's not about the road. Maybe it's about who's waitin' at the end of it." He looked at her, the light catching in her hair, and for a moment, time folded back to kids on this same bridge, daring each other to dream. "Clara," he said quietly, "you ever regret not leavin'?" She smiled faintly. "Once or twice. But then I'd hear the mountains token. They'd say, 'You stay, and he'll find his way back.'" Guess they were right. They sat in silence, listening to the river. Then Clara stood and brushed the dust from her skirt. "Come by the school tomorrow. The kids are writin' letters to folks they miss. You might teach 'em a thing or two about words." Cole chuckled. "Reckon I could do that." The next day, he did. He showed the children how to start a letter, how to write from the heart instead of the hand. Some wrote to fathers they'd never met, others to friends gone off to distant towns. When Clara read them aloud, Cole felt something shift inside him, a weight lifting, as if every word written on those pages loosened a little of the sorrow still tethered to his soul. That evening, Clara handed him a single folded sheet. "They all wrote to someone. I figured you should too." Cole unfolded it. The page was blank. He laughed softly. "You always did have a way of making me think." "That's the point," she said with a grin. "You got a lot left to say, Cole Tanner. Don't let it stay unwritten." He looked down at the blank page, and for once it didn't scare him. It felt like promise, like a dawn still waiting to rise. That night, under a sky full of stars, Cole began another letter, not to Clara this time, and not to the past, but to himself. A note of forgiveness, of understanding, of peace earned, not given. When he finished, he folded it, tucked it inside his journal, and whispered, "Maybe that's enough for tonight." Outside, the wind rustled the cottonwoods, and the mountains whispered back low and steady, like an old friend saying, "You've made it home at last." Summer in Willow Bend came early that year, spilling light across the valley like gold dust. The hills turned green and the river ran strong, carrying the scent of wild sage down through the canyon. Cole Tanner rose each morning with the dawn, his hands steady, his heart lighter than it had been in years. There was work to be done always, but it no longer felt like penance. It felt like belonging. One warm morning, Clara stopped by the livery with a basket of biscuits and a jar of honey. "Thought you might have skipped breakfast," she said, setting it down on a bale of hay. Cole smiled. "You trying to fatten me up? Somebody's gotta keep you from blowing away in the wind." They laughed, easy and familiar. For a while, they ate in companionable silence, watching sunlight pour through the slats in the stable wall. Then Clara said quietly, "The church is planning a picnic up near Cotton Ridge next Sunday. You should come." Cole paused mid-bite. "You know I don't mix much with crowds." "It ain't about crowds," she said gently. "It's about being part of things again." He hesitated, then nodded. "Guess I could use a little sun that ain't from the saddle." When Sunday came, the whole town seemed to spill into the meadow. Children ran barefoot through the tall grass, women laid out pies and quilts, and men traded stories of weather, crops, and cattle. For a man who'd spent years living between silence and horizon, it was almost too much. But when Clara appeared beside him, her blue dress catching the wind, he felt the noise settle into music. They ate under a cottonwood tree while laughter drifted around them. Eli joined, tipping his hat and grinning. "Ain't this something?" The old outlaw turned respectable. Cole chuckled. "Don't go ruining my reputation." "Too late," Eli said. "The preacher's already bragging you fixed the chapel roof." The afternoon stretched warm and lazy. Clara's students gathered near the creek, skipping stones and shouting when one skipped more than twice. Cole showed a little boy how to angle his wrist just right, and the stone danced across the water 5 times before sinking. The boy cheered. "You're real good at this," Mr. Cole smiled. "All it takes is patience and a steady hand." Later, as the crowd began to pack up, the preacher stood and offered a few words. "We've all lost things," he said, "and we've all come through storms we thought would never end. But sometimes grace finds us not in grand miracles, but in the small mercy of another day." Cole felt Clara's hand brush his. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then she said softly, "He's right, you know, about grace, about small mercies." He looked at her, the sunlight glinting in her eyes, and thought, "This right here, this is mercy." When the sun dipped low, they rode back toward town side by side. The trail glowed amber in the fading light. "You ever wonder what comes next?" she asked. "Used to," he said. "Now I figure next'll take care of itself." A few weeks later, a letter arrived in Willow Bend, addressed to Cole Tanner. The handwriting was neat but unfamiliar. Inside was a short note from a rancher out near the Utah line. He'd found a set of journals in an old stagecoach trunk, one of which had Cole's name scratched inside. The man offered to send them along. Cole turned the letter over in his hands. surprised by how steady he felt. "More ghosts," he muttered. "Guess they're still following." When the package arrived, he and Clara sat together to open it. Inside were two small books bound in cracked leather. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but the words were his. Stories he'd written years ago while riding the borderlands. Tales of dust, wind, and the ache of missing home. Clara read a few lines aloud, her voice soft as wind through pine. "These are beautiful, Cole. Why'd you stop writin' like this?" He shrugged. "Didn't think anyone cared to read, Em." "I do," she said simply, "and I think others would, too." For a moment, he didn't answer. Then he said, "Maybe it's time I shared, Em. Not for me, but for the ones still ridin' lonely." That night, they sat on the porch, watching fireflies spark against the dark. The air was warm, heavy with the scent of sage and clover. Clara leaned her head on his shoulder, and for once, Cole didn't flinch from the closeness. He let the quiet settle deep into him. "Clara," he said softly, "you ever think about the stories we don't finish?" She smiled. "Maybe they're not meant to end. Maybe they're meant to keep us going." He looked out toward the mountains, their silhouettes dark and endless against the stars. "Then I reckon this one's still ridin' steady." The crickets sang. The world seemed small and vast all at once. Cole Tanner, once the man who waited too long to begin, finally felt that he'd begun exactly where he needed to. Before turning in, he opened his journal again and wrote, "Some stories don't end at all. They just find quieter trails to ride." He closed the book, laid it on the table, and smiled to himself as the mountains whispered outside his window. Autumn rolled through Willow Bend with a hush. The air grew crisp, the aspens turned to gold, and the days began to shrink like pages near the end of a book. Cole Tanner watched the color bleed across the hills and felt the quiet stretch deeper inside him. He'd spent his life chasing horizons, and yet here, settled among the whispers of wind and pine, he'd found a kind of stillness he never thought possible. The saloon didn't see much of him anymore. His nights were spent writing by lamplight, slow and careful, words unfurling like smoke. Clara often joined him, reading in silence or sketching by the fire. One evening, as the fire cracked low, she looked up from her book. "You've been different lately," she said. Cole raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" "Lighter. Like you're finally carryin' less." He smiled faintly. "Maybe I just learned to leave the saddlebags behind." She tilted her head. "What are you writing about now?" "About a man who forgot how to start," Cole said. His pen paused mid-sentence. "And about how, sometimes, startin' over don't mean ridden. A wet means stayin' put." Clara nodded, her gaze soft. "I'd like to read that one." "You will," he promised. The next morning, the first frost arrived. The grass shone silver, the air bit cold. Cole saddled his horse early and rode toward the ridge to check the winter line. The horizon was clear, the sky pale blue. He breathed deep, feeling the mountain air burn his lungs clean. Halfway up, he spotted smoke from an old miner's shack, thin, gray, uncertain. He rode closer and found Eli outside, nursing a busted hand. "What in blazes happened to you?" Cole called. Eli grinned sheepishly. "Tried fixing a stovepipe." Stove bit back. Cole dismounted and laughed. "You need a hand." "Wouldn't mind it." Coffee's still warm. They patched the pipe together, trading quiet jokes between hammer strikes. When they were done, Eli poured 2 cups of coffee and said, "Heard the preacher askin' you to speak at next month's meeting." Cole frowned. "Me, ain't much for token in front of folks. Doesn't matter, Eli said. They want to hear from you. Folks notice when a man changes. Cole gives 'em hope that maybe they can. 2. Cole looked into the cup, steam curling up like breath. I ain't no preacher, no, Eli said. But sometimes people don't need preaching. They just need proof it's possible. When Cole rode home, Clara was sweeping the porch. He told her about Eli's words, and she smiled. He's right, you know. Maybe your story ain't just yours anymore. That night, Cole wrote longer than usual. He wrote about the long trails, the cold mornings, the nights he spent talking to the stars. He wrote about loss and mercy and the quiet strength that comes from startin' again when no one 's watchin'. Days turned colder. Snow crept into the valley, slow and deliberate. The ranchers brought their cattle in, and the children built fires in the schoolyard to keep warm. Clara began teaching her students the old Christmas hymns, their voices carrying across the frozen air. Cole helped the blacksmith repair sleigh runners, fixed fences that groaned under ice, and delivered chopped wood to widows' houses. He did it without thought of reward. For the first time, his life wasn't about atonement, it was about usefulness. Then, one evening, as he walked home under a pale moon, he saw a rider approaching from the east. The man wore a heavy duster, his horse lathered from travel. When he reached Cole, he pulled down his scarf and said, "You, Tanner, used to be," Cole said. "Who's Eskin? Name's Jessup. I run freight out of Santa Fe. Picked up a letter with your mark on it. Figured it might be important." He handed Cole a sealed envelope, yellowed and worn. The handwriting made Cole's breath catch. It was his brother's. "Where'd you find this?" he asked. Jessup shrugged. "Came through an old post ledger. Guess it got lost years ago." Cole stood in the cold long after the rider left, staring at the letter. His brother, Thomas, had been gone near 20 years, lost to fever out on the cattle trail. With trembling hands, he broke the seal and read, "Cole, if this ever reaches you, know that I never held nothin' against you. You did what you thought right. The trail's long, brother, but you'll find your way home. Don't wait too long to forgive yourself." The words hit like a bell toll in the night clear, final, merciful. Cole felt something inside him shift, like snow sliding off a roof after a long storm. He whispered, "Took me a while, Tom, but I got there." He folded the letter carefully and carried it inside. Clara was at the table, mending one of his shirts. When she saw his face, she asked softly, "You all right?" He handed her the letter. She read it slowly, then looked up with tears in her eyes. He knew Cole. Even back then, Cole nodded. "Guess he was waiting for me to catch up." She reached across the table and took his hand. "Then let's not waste any more time looking back." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Inside, the fire glowed warm, steady. Cole Tanner sat there with the woman who'd taught him to listen again to himself, to forgiveness, to life, and, for the first time, the silence didn't scare him. It felt like peace. Before bed, he opened his journal again and wrote, "I used to think I was ridin' toward redemption, but maybe redemption was ridin' toward me the whole damn time." He closed the book and smiled, listening as the winter wind carried the faint, eternal whisper of the mountains. The first heavy snow of winter blanketed Willow Bend in silence. Roads disappeared beneath soft, white drifts. Fences turned into pale lines under moonlight, and every sound seemed to fall slower, quieter. For most folks, it was a season for staying in fires, stew, stories by the hearth. But for Cole Tanner, it was a time to remember how much peace could fit inside the quiet. He woke early each morning to shovel the schoolhouse path for Clara. She'd laugh and tell him the children didn't mind trudging through snow, but he'd shake his head and say, "Let em have one less hardship." Sometimes he'd bring coffee to the door, steam curling up like breath in the cold. Clara would kiss his cheek and whisper, "You're makin' this place better, Cole, one little kindness at a time." The town was small, but winter made it feel smaller. The saloon lights dimmed earlier, the smithy worked by lantern, and yet the stillness had its own beauty, a hush that seemed to hold the stories of everyone who'd ever passed through. One night, near Christmas, the townsfolk gathered in the church hall. The air smelled of pine and cider, laughter mixing with fiddle tunes. Clara stood near the piano, leading a hymn, her voice pure and steady. Cole lingered near the door, half in shadow, watching her. He didn't sing, he didn't need to. Her voice said everything he'd once tried to find in words. After the service, Sheriff Hayes approached him with a slow grin. "Never thought I'd see you stayin' for carols, Tanner." Cole smirked. "Figured I'd start small. Maybe next year I'll even clap." Hayes chuckled. "You've come a long way, partner. A few years back, you'd have been halfway to the next county by now." Cole shrugged. "Guess I ran out of counties." The sheriff nodded, then lowered his voice. "You ever think about ridin' down to Austin come spring? State's settin' up a land program giving parcels to men who'll farm or settle. You got the hands and the heart for it." Cole thought for a moment. "Used to think land was what a man owned. Now I think it's what a man belongs to. I'll talk to Clara, but right now I reckon I'm where I should be." The two men shared a quiet nod. Outside, snow began to fall against soft, endless. Later that night, back home, Cole found himself unable to sleep. The fire had burned low. He poured a little coffee, sat by the window, and listened. Beyond the cabin walls, the world was still. He could almost hear the mountains breathing under the snow, whispering through the pines. That sound had followed him all his life, from the mesas of Arizona to the hills of Montana, but now it felt different, softer, kinder. He thought about his brother's letter again, about forgiveness arriving late, but still on time. He thought about Clara, and the children she taught to read their first words by lamplight. He thought about how a man's life, no matter how rough, could still end in peace if he stopped long enough to listen. A knock broke the silence. Cole stood, surprised. It was past midnight. He opened the door to find a young man shivering on the porch, coat torn, horse nowhere in sight. "Please," the man said, his voice trembling. "My sister, she's sick. Our wagon broke by the creek. I didn't know where else to go." Cole didn't hesitate. "Get inside, warm up, then we'll ride." Clara appeared from the bedroom, pulling on her coat. "You're not goin' alone," she said. Within minutes, they were riding through the snow, lanterns swinging, hooves crunching on the frozen road. The wind bit sharp, the trail invisible, but the young man Samuel guided them by memory. After half an hour, they spotted the wagon, half buried, a single candle flickering inside. Cole dismounted first, opened the door, and found a young woman wrapped in blankets, her skin pale and lips cracked. Clara knelt beside her, checking her pulse. "Fever," she said quietly. "We need to get her warm now." They loaded her onto Cole's horse, wrapped tight in his coat, and rode slowly back through the storm. When they reached the cabin, Clara went straight to work boiling water, mixing herbs, keeping vigil through the long hours. Coal fed the fire, melting snow for water, wiping sweat from the woman's forehead as Clara directed. By dawn, the fever broke. The woman her name was May breathed easier. Clara smiled, exhausted but relieved. She's gonna be all right. Samuel gripped Cole's arm, tears in his eyes. I don't know how to thank you. Cole shook his head. You don't owe me a thing. Just take care of her. They stayed 2 more days before heading on their way. Before leaving, Samuel handed Cole a small silver locket. This was my mother's, he said. She used to say, kindness is a trail that always leads you home. Seems like you found yours. Cole accepted it quietly, feeling its weight light, yet full of meaning. After they left, Clara placed the locket on the mantel. You've done a lot of ridin' in your life, she said softly, but tonight felt like your truest journey. Cole looked out the window. Snow still falling, maybe so. Guess the trail don't always lead west. The days that followed were slow and bright. The snow melted, rivers broke open again, and willow buds began to bloom. Cole repaired fences, sharpened tools, and worked with Clara to build a new porch swing. He didn't talk much, but his silences were no longer heavy. They were full of things understood without words. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, Clara leaned against him and said, You ever think about writin' a book? About your life, I mean. He chuckled. Dan T. Think folks care much for a story about an old cowboy who took too long to grow up. I think they'd care more than you know, she said, smiling. Stories like that, Dante, just tell people what happened. They tell what's possible. Cole considered it. Maybe someday, he thought. For now, it was enough to live it. Outside, the mountains glowed orange and gold in the fading light. A hawk wheeled above the valley, its cry sharp and lonely, but somehow full of promise. Cole watched it disappear into the horizon and whispered, Ride safe, friend. He turned back toward the cabin where Clara was lighting the lamps. The smell of bread filled the air, the warmth of the hearth spilling into the night. And for the first time in a long, long while, Cole Tanner didn't feel like a man between destinations. He felt home. Spring returned to Willow Bend with a soft kind of glory. The snow melted into clear streams that carved through the meadows, and the mountains, once cloaked in white, now shimmered with green and gold. Cole Tanner could feel the land waking beneath his boots, the earth stretching, breathing again. It was the kind of season that made a man wonder if maybe everything broken could find a way to mend. He spent most mornings repairing the barn roof or tending to Clara's new garden patch, which she swore would bloom with color by summer. He didn't know much about flowers, but he liked watching her work, sleeves rolled, hair tied loose, humming to herself. Sometimes she'd catch him staring and laugh. You plan on helping or just admirin'? She'd tease. I'm admirin' efficiently, he'd answer. Saves energy. But even as life settled into that sweet rhythm, something restless stirred in Cole again, the kind that made him want to leave, but the kind that made him think deeper. Maybe it was the letter from his brother, still folded in his pocket. Maybe it was the ache of unfinished dreams. One afternoon, he rode out toward the ridge with his journal in the saddlebag. He dismounted by a cluster of pines and sat overlooking the valley. Below, Willow Bend shimmered like a small, breathing thing, smoke from chimneys, cattle grazing, the faint echo of a hammer at the smithy. He pulled out his pencil and wrote, It's strange how silence can be loud when you've learned to listen. I used to think loneliness was an emptiness, But now I think it's a space, one the heart fills when it's ready. He paused, watching a hawk trace the sky. Then he wrote again. Maybe stories don't end where we think they do. Maybe they just change pace, like a trail that turns but keeps on going. Different view, same dust. When he got home, Clara was sitting by the fire, reading one of his older letters. She looked up, smiling softly. "You know," she said, "you've got the bones of a book here. The way you write it, like you re-talkin' to folks who ain't been listened to in a while." Cole laughed lightly. "Guess I know that feeling well." Clara closed the journal. "Promise me something, Cole. If you ever do finish it, don't keep it to yourself." He nodded, though he wasn't sure he believed it yet. A few days later, news came that Sheriff Hayes had been injured trying to break up a brawl at the freight yard. Cole rode into town to check on him. The sheriff lay in the clinic, arm bandaged, but his spirit still sharp. "Just a scrape," Hayes said. "Don't go plannin' my funeral." Cole grinned. "Wouldn't dream of it. You're too ornery to die." Hayes chuckled, then gestured to the window. "Town's changing. More folks comin' through since the rail survey started. They're saying they might put a line through Willow Bend." Cole raised an eyebrow. "A railroad, yup, means jobs, trade, maybe trouble. Depends on who you ask." Cole looked out the window. He could almost hear the distant whistle of progress. The thought of it unsettled him. Steel and smoke cutting through the quiet valleys. But he also knew time didn't wait for any man. When he returned home, Clara listened quietly as he told her. "Do you think it's good for the town?" she asked. "Depends on what kind of men run it," Cole said. "Progress has a way of forgetting the people it steps over." That night, he couldn't sleep. He went outside, boots crunching on the thawing ground. The moon hung bright over the peaks, and for a long while he just stared at it. He'd seen that same moon from countless places across deserts, prairies, forgotten towns. But here it felt different, steadier. In the weeks that followed, strangers began passing through, surveyors, drifters, traders. Some stayed, some didn't. Willow Bend buzzed with talk of opportunity. But where there's opportunity, there's always someone ready to take more than his share. It started small: missing cattle, broken fences. Then, one night, old Eli came into town, bruised and bloody. "Ran into rustlers near the canyon," he said. "4 of 'em took my herd." Cole's jaw tightened. "You see their faces?" Eli nodded. One tall fella, scar on his cheek, wore a coat with silver buttons. Cole knew that kind of man. Opportunists who rode with progress, claiming it as excuse for greed. The next morning, he saddled his horse, loaded his rifle, and told Clara he'd be back before dark. "I don't want you going alone," she said. He kissed her forehead. "I won't be. The mountains all ride with me." He found the rustlers by sundown, camped by the canyon, drunk on stolen whiskey. There were 4, just like Eli said. Cole waited in the shadows, watching the firelight flicker on their faces. The one with the scar laughed loudest, bragging about easy pickings. Cole stepped into the open, rifle leveled. "That herd don't belong to you." They froze. The scarred man smirked. "Ain't no law out here, cowboy." Cole's voice was calm. "Then maybe you oughta act like there is." The man drew his pistol, but Cole was faster. One shot into the air, clean and sharp. "Next one ain't for warning," he said. The others backed down quick. The scarred man glared, spitting into the dirt. "You ain't got the stomach for this." Cole lowered his rifle slightly, eyes cold. You'd be surprised what a man finds in himself when he's done running. By dawn, the herd was home, the rustlers long gone. Cole didn't tell the sheriff. He didn't brag. Some things didn't need telling. That night, Clara held his hand over dinner. "I knew you'd come back." Cole smiled faintly. "Didn't have much choice. Got too much here worth comin' back to." Outside, the wind whispered through the pines again, low and soft, like a voice older than memory. Cole listened, heart steady, and thought of all the trails that had led him here, not roads of dust and danger, but roads of grace, forgiveness, and finally belonging. He realized something then. Maybe a man's redemption was in one moment or one act. Maybe it was a lifetime of small, quiet choices to stay, to help, to forgive, to love. He picked up his pencil and wrote by lamplight. You don't find peace at the end of the road. You build it, one sunrise at a time. Summer came to Willow Bend like a deep, contented sigh. The valley rippled with wildflowers. The rivers ran high and clear, and the days stretched long enough to forget what hurry ever felt like. Cole Tanner woke each morning before the sun, the smell of dew and hay drifting through the open window, Clara humming softly as she brewed coffee by the stove. The years of dust and distance had melted from his face, replaced by something steadier, quieter, man at peace with both his past and his present. The town itself was changing fast. The railroad surveyors had staked their markers along the ridge, and the hammering of metal rang through the hills like a promise and a warning at once. Some folks were thrilled, others worried what it might bring. Cole listened, but mostly he watched. He'd seen what progress could do at built towns, yes, but it also took their soul if nobody was careful. One evening, Sheriff Hayes rode out to the cabin, his hat low and his face grave. "Got word from the capital," he said. "Rail companies pushin' harder than we thought. They're claiming right through Eli's pasture." Cole frowned. "That pasture feeds half the valley come winter." "Yup, they don't much care. Says they'll compensate him if he signs quick." Cole glanced toward the mountains, their edges glowing pink in the late light. "And if he don't," Hayes sighed, "they'll take it anyway." The next morning, Cole rode out to Eli's place. The old rancher was sitting on the porch, hat in hand, the contract spread across his lap. "You hear about this mess?" he asked. "I did," Cole said. "You gonna sign it?" Eli shook his head slowly. "I been ranchin' that land 40 years, Cole. My wife's buried up on that ridge. Ain't enough money in the world for me to sell it." Cole sat beside him. "Then you ain't alone." Eli looked over. "What are you thinkin'?" "Thinkin' maybe Willow Bend's due for a stand." That afternoon, word spread through town. Cole Tanner was calling a meeting. By dusk, the church hall was full. Ranchers, miners, shopkeepers, Saul talking at once. Cole stood by the front, hat in hand, waiting for the noise to settle. "Most of you know me," he began, his voice steady. "And most of you remember what happens when you let other folks make your choices. I rode too many miles runnin' from my own mistakes, and I can tell you no good ever came from letting somebody else decide your worth." He paused, letting the words breathe. "Now, I ain't sayin' the railroad's evil. It'll bring trade, travel, maybe even a future for our kids. But if we let 'em take what's ours without listening, we'll lose more than land, we'll lose who we are." The room fell quiet. Then Clara stepped forward, voice calm but strong. "Cole's right. We can't stop progress, but we can make it meet us halfway. If we stand together, they'll have to talk. not just take. For a moment, silence held the room like a breath. Then Sheriff Hayes nodded. She's right. If Willow Bend speaks with one voice, the company's got no choice but to listen. The crowd murmured in agreement. Men who hadn't spoken in years shook hands. Women nodded, eyes fierce. A feeling took root that hadn't been there before, not anger, but unity. Over the next week, Cole helped organize the town's petition. He met with the surveyors, calm but firm. You run your line around Eli's Ridge, he said. There's plenty of ground that don't belong to the dead. The company men didn't like it. They threatened, bargained, bluffed, but Willow Bend stood together. Word spread fast, and soon other towns along the survey began writing letters. By midsummer, a delegation from the state arrived to review local concerns. Cole stood beside Eli as they made their case. When the officials left, the valley waited days, then weeks. Finally, a letter came. The new rail line would shift 3 miles east. Eli's Ridge would stay untouched. That night, the whole town gathered at the saloon, not for whiskey, but for celebration. The piano played, boots stomped, and even the sheriff tried to dance before giving up laughing. Clara leaned against Cole's shoulder and whispered, "You did it." He shook his head. "No, we did it." As the night wore on, Cole slipped outside. The sky above Willow Bend was a stretch of quiet stars, brighter than any lantern could ever burn. He thought of his brother, of the trail that had once stretched endless before him. Somewhere along the way, he'd stopped looking for peace in far-off places. He'd found it here in people, in purpose, in staying. But life, he knew, never stopped turning. A few days later, a letter arrived, addressed to Cole, in careful handwriting. It was from a publisher in Denver. Seems one of Clara's friends had sent in a few pages from his journal without telling him. "Mr. Tanner," the letter began, "your reflections on life in the West have a voice we dainty often hear, one of quiet truth and grace. If you have more to say, we'd like to read it." Cole read it twice before setting it down. Clara, standing behind him, grinned. "Told you so," he chuckled. "You did. Guess I'm outta excuses." That evening, he began to write again, for himself this time, but for whoever might need to hear what he'd learned the hard way, about regret, about forgiveness, about the kind of courage it takes to stop running. His words flowed steady, sure as river water after the thaw. He wrote until dawn, when the first gold light touched the peaks. Then he stepped outside, stretching his back, watching the valley wake. The wind was gentle, the same whispering wind that had carried him through every trail and turn. But now it didn't sound lonely, it sounded alive. Like the mountains themselves were saying, "You finally made it home." Clara came up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly. Cole smiled, eyes on the horizon. "Thinkin' maybe I'll call it Letters to the Quiet Trail." She kissed his shoulder. "It's perfect." He took a deep breath, letting the morning fill his chest. "Yeah," he said quietly, "it is." And for the first time, Cole Tanner didn't feel like a man remembering his life. He felt like a man living it. Autumn came early that year, sweeping down the mountains with a whisper like memory. The air turned crisp, the fields gold, and the leaves burned amber before falling silent into the grass. Cole Tanner sat on the porch of the cabin one evening, boots resting on the rail, journal open across his knees. The last page fluttered in the wind like a restless thought. Clara brought him a cup of coffee and sat beside him. "You've been staring at that page for an hour," she said. He smiled faintly. "Guess I don't know how to finish." Maybe it ain't supposed to finish, she replied, her gaze soft and far away. Maybe it just keeps going, like them mountains. He closed the notebook gently. Yeah, maybe so. That night, Cole rode out along the ridge, rode the same trail he'd taken the night he'd left Willow Bend years ago. The moon hung full over the valley, the same quiet silver that had watched him through every turn of his life. He stopped at the old oak by the crossroads. The bark was scarred where he'd carved his initials once, a lifetime ago. He thought of the man he'd been, restless, stubborn, scared to stand still long enough to be known. Now he couldn't imagine leaving. Funny thing, time it didn't heal everything, but it taught you how to live with the things that didn't. Down below, the town lights twinkled like grounded stars. He could almost hear laughter from the saloon, the rhythm of the world moving on. Cole tipped his hat, then turned the horse toward home. The following week brought visitors from Denver, 2 men in crisp suits and an editor named Mrs. Greenfield. They'd come to meet the cowboy writer whose letters had started appearing in newspapers across the state. They found him splitting wood behind the barn. "Mr. Tanner," one of the men asked, stepping carefully over the dirt. Cole leaned on the axe handle, wiping sweat from his brow. "That's me. I'm Edward Collins, from Frontier Monthly. We'd like to publish your stories full collection, bound edition." Cole blinked, surprised. "My stories?" "Yes, sir. The world's changing, Mr. Tanner. Folks back east, they're hungry for truth, not just tall tales. You've lived what they only imagine." Clara appeared at the door, hands flour-dusted from baking. "Told you someone'd come knockin'." The editor smiled. "Mrs. Tanner, your husband has a gift." Cole laughed, scratching his neck. Gift or curse, depending on the day. They spent hours at the kitchen table, papers spread out, contracts explained. Cole listened, nodding, though part of him drifted to the fields beyond the window, the horses grazing, the world still and right. When they left, promising to send word soon, Clara touched his hand. "How's it feel?" he thought for a moment. "Like I'm telling the truth for the first time." Weeks turned into months. Winter crept down from the peaks, soft and sure. The first snow fell over Willow Bend, blanketing the valley in silence. Cole and Clara spent their evenings by the fire, he wrote. She read aloud from old letters he'd never mailed. One night, she unfolded one written to his brother long ago. "You ever wish you'd sent this?" she asked. He stared into the flames. "I used to. Now I think he hears me just fine," she nodded. "He'd be proud, Cole." He smiled faintly. "Maybe, but more'n that I hope he'd see I finally stopped running in February." A parcel arrived from Denver. Letters to the quiet trailer book, bound in deep brown leather. Cole's name embossed in gold across the front. Clara cried the first time she held it. Cole just ran his thumb over the cover, silent. The next Sunday, Pastor Miller invited him to read a passage at church. The congregation packed the little room, eager to hear the words of their own cowboy writer. Cole stood at the pulpit, heart steady, hands rough against the paper. He began softly. "Some men chase the horizon their whole lives, thinking peace is something you find when you get there. But the truth is, peace ain't out there, it's what you build where you stand. It's the sound of wind in the grass, the look in someone's eyes when you finally stay put. It's forgiving yourself, even when the past don't ask for it." When he finished, the church was silent. Then someone started clapping. Then everyone. Cole felt his throat tighten. He nodded once, stepped down, and took Clara's hand. "Let's go home," he whispered. That spring, a letter arrived from a schoolteacher in Kansas. "Mr. Tanner, my students read your stories out loud in class. They say it makes them want to listen to the wind more. One boy told me he wrote his own letter to the mountain behind his house. Thought you'd like to know you made a few hearts quiet again." Cole smiled when he read it. "Guess the world still needs quiet trails," he said. He and Clara spent more time together that year, mornings tending the garden, afternoons reading on the porch. Sometimes travelers stopped by, hoping to meet him, the man who wrote like he'd lived 100 lives. Cole always greeted them the same, with coffee, a story, and the advice that peace is something you learn slow. Late one summer evening, Cole rode alone up the ridge trail. The same trail where he'd once wandered lost, the same one that had led him home. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in copper and rose. He dismounted and sat in the grass, pulling out his old harmonica. The tune he played was soft, almost shy, like the whisper of the valley itself. When he stopped, the world was utterly still. He closed his eyes, breathed deep, and felt something shift inside him, not a longing, not regret, but gratitude. He looked to the horizon and said quietly, "I'm here." The wind answered in a hush of grass. When he rode home, Clara was waiting on the porch with 2 mugs of coffee. "You were gone a while," she said. "Had to say thank you," he replied. "For what?" "For all of it." The stars came out, one by one, until the valley shimmered beneath their light. Somewhere out there, trains passed, towns grew, time rolled on. But for Cole Tanner, the world had finally gone still enough to hear its own heartbeat, and in that quiet, he realized he hadn't just found peace, he'd become it. The year turned once more, gentle as breath, and Willow Bend settled into its familiar rhythm. Calves were born, rivers thawed, and the smell of pine and dust filled the air again. Cole Tanner had learned to measure his days not by the ticking of a clock, but by the slow language of the land. The way the sun crept over the ridge, the way the light changed on Clara's face every morning at breakfast. He didn't ride as far anymore, though the horse still pawed at the gate, sometimes restless for open plains. "Not today, partner," Cole would say with a smile, patting its neck. "The horizon ain't going anywhere." One afternoon, a telegram arrived from Denver. The publisher wanted him to come to the city for a reading event, a gathering of authors and readers celebrating Western voices. Cole read the message twice, the words strange and bright on the page. "They want me in Denver," he murmured. Clara was kneading bread dough at the counter. "You should go," she said. "You've earned this." He shook his head slowly. City folks don't need an old cowboy cluttering up their fancy halls, but she wouldn't have it. "Cole Tanner," she said firmly, "you spent half your life running from who you were. Don't you dare start hiding from who you've become." A week later, he boarded a train for the first time in 20 years. The iron beast groaned and hissed, pulling away from the platform as Clara waved from the tracks. He tipped his hat and watched her fade into the distance until the fields swallowed everything but memory. The rhythm of the rails was strange and soothing, steady, like a long heartbeat. Denver hit him like thunder. Noise everywhere. Electric lights buzzing. People walking fast, talking faster. Cole felt like a ghost from another century. The hotel clerk handed him a brass key with a polite smile. "Mr. Tanner, we're honored to have you. The reading is tomorrow evening at the Civic Hall." He thanked the man and took the elevator, his first ever ride in one. The small box of metal and mirrors made him uneasy. like he'd stepped inside a coffin of light. That night, he barely slept. He stood by the window, watching the city hum beneath him. He could see the mountains in the distance, dark and solid, the same ones that had watched him grow old. He whispered, "Don't worry, I'll be back soon." The city lights flickered like stars trapped in glass. The next evening, the hall was packed. Rows of seats, polished wood, and faces from every walk of life. Farmers, teachers, veterans, students. The announcer introduced him as the cowboy poet of silence, a title that made him laugh softly to himself. When he stepped on stage, the room went still. He stood behind the podium, hat in hand. The microphone, a curious contraption he didn't quite trust. He began with a story not from his book, but from his heart. "I once thought life was something you had to chase down," he said, voice low and gravelly. "Turns out it was waiting on me to stop riding so fast." The crowd chuckled softly. Then he read from letters to the quiet trail, his voice steady as wind through pine. He spoke of loss, of forgiveness, of how silence teaches you things noise never can. When he finished, the applause was thunderous. A woman in the front row was crying. A young man stood and shouted, "That was beautiful, sir." Cole smiled, tipping his hat. "Thank you, son. I just told the truth the way I heard it." Afterward, people lined up to shake his hand, ask for signatures, share stories of their own. A boy with a stutter said, "Mr. Tanner, I read your book with my grandpa. We talk different now, quieter, but better." Cole's heart swelled. "That's worth more than any book," he said. Later that night, the publisher invited him to a dinner party with writers and journalists. There were bright chandeliers, glasses clinking, laughter that didn't quite reach the heart. Cole sat politely, listening to the talk of sales, markets, fame. A woman leaned across the table and said, "Mr. Tanner, what inspires your writing?" He paused, then said, "The sound of nothing. You ever listen to nothin' long enough, you start hearin' everything that matters." The table went quiet. Then someone nodded, then another smiled. He left early, stepping out into the cold Denver night. Snow had started falling, soft as whispers. He pulled his coat tighter and walked until the noise faded behind him. He ended up by the edge of the city, where the ground sloped down toward the plains. The lights shimmered below, and far beyond them, the faint outline of mountains waited. "Almost home," he murmured. The next morning, he took the early train back to Willow Bend. When he stepped off, Clara was there waiting with a blanket and that same knowing smile. "How was it?" she asked. He kissed her forehead. "Loud," he said, "but good loud. Folks still listen when you give 'em something true." They rode back in silence, the wagon wheels crunching over frozen earth. He felt the land breathing again, as if welcoming him back. That night, by the fire, he opened his journal and began a new story. Not about cowboys or the West. He told Clara about us, about what happens after the dust settles. She smiled. "Then it'll be your best one yet." Weeks passed, and the snow melted once more. The valleys bloomed green, rivers swelled, and the sound of birds returned to the fields. Cole found himself sitting on the porch most days, watching it all unfold. He'd become part of the rhythm, no longer an outsider trying to tame it. When neighbors stopped by, he offered them stories and pie. When travelers came through, he offered directions and a reminder. Don T. Rush, what S meant to be slow. He sometimes received letters from strangers, city folks, soldiers, widows each one, saying how his words had helped them find quiet in their own storms. He answered every one, writing by lamplight. We all walk our own trail, he'd write, but sometimes the wind carries a voice that helps us find our way. By late summer, the publisher sent news that his second collection was already selling better than the first. Cole just chuckled and said, "Guess folks still like slow stories." But in his heart, he knew it wasn't about books. It was about connection, the invisible thread between one quiet soul and another. As the sun set one evening, Clara asked softly, "Do you ever miss the man you used to be?" Cole thought for a long time before answering. "No," he said finally. "I just thank him for ridin' far enough to let me find this." She smiled, leaned her head on his shoulder, and together they watched the last light fade from the sky to silhouettes against the endless hush of the valley. And somewhere deep in that silence, the mountains whispered again. The years rolled by quietly, like a slow river wearing down stone. Cole Tanner's hair turned silver, his steps a little slower, but his voice steady as wind through cedar remained strong. The town of Willow Bend changed around him. The old saloon became a bakery, the rail line stretched further west, and a new schoolhouse rose where the old blacksmith's forge once stood. Children ran through the streets he'd once ridden down, their laughter echoing like new songs in an old tune. Cole would sit on the porch most mornings, coffee in hand, and watch life keep on living. Sometimes travelers still came. They arrived dusty and tired, their boots worn thin from chasing something they couldn't name. They'd heard about the cowboy who wrote the quiet stories, and they came hoping to ask him how to find peace. Cole never gave them complicated answers. "Sit a while," he'd say, motioning to a chair. "Listen to the wind, then tell me what it says." And they'd sit together, sometimes for hours, saying nothing. By the time they left, their eyes were softer, their voices slower. "Thank you," they'd whisper, and he'd smile. "Don't thank me, thank the silence." One afternoon, a young reporter from San Francisco arrived, a woman named June Parker. She wore a wide hat and carried a notebook full of questions. "Mr. Tanner," she began, "you've become something of a legend out west. They call you the philosopher, cowboy. What do you make of that?" Cole laughed so hard he had to set his coffee down. "Philosopher? Ma'am, I barely passed schooling. I just wrote what the land taught me." June smiled. "Then maybe the land's the real philosopher." He liked that answer. She stayed for 2 days, interviewing him about his early life, his years on the trail, his writing. At one point she asked, "Do you regret not leaving Willow Bend again? You could have had fame, fortune, the big cities." Cole looked out at the hills, green and golden in the fading light. "If I'd gone looking for all that, I might have lost the only thing that ever mattered. The quiet here, it's worth more than gold. Fame fades faster than sunset." When she left, she gave him a photograph she'd taken. Cole sitting on the porch, the mountains behind him like ancient guardians. "For your next story," she said, "every legend deserves a face." That winter was colder than most. Snow piled high against the fences, and the creeks froze solid. Clara fell ill for a spell. Nothing serious at first, just a cough that lingered too long. Cole stayed by her side, tending the fire, reading to her from the books she loved. One night, as the wind howled outside, she reached for his hand. "You remember that first night you came back?" she whispered. He smiled softly. "I remember everything about it. You said you didn't know how to stay still. Funny how life taught you that." He squeezed her hand gently. "You were the lesson, Clara," she smiled, eyes glistening. "Then we both learned something, didn't we?" The storm raged through the night, snow tapping against the window like 1,000 small hands. By morning, the world was white and still. Clara's fever broke, and she slowly regained her strength, though Cole never strayed far from her side again. He'd learned how quickly the world could change, how fragile even peace could be. As spring returned, so did her laughter. They planted new flowers in front of the porch, wild daisies, her favorite. Every time they bloomed, she'd point and say, "They look like they're smiling." In the summer of his 75th year, Cole received another letter from Denver. The publisher wanted to create a collected edition of all his works, the complete letters of Cole Tanner. They asked for a foreword from him, something to leave readers with, a reflection on a life spent listening to the land. He sat down at his desk one quiet morning, sunlight spilling across the wooden floor. After a moment of thought, he began to write. "I've been called many things in my life, a drifter, a dreamer, a fool, maybe all three fit. But if there's one thing I've learned riding this long road, it's that you can't chase peace, you build it. One choice, one sunrise, one forgiveness at a time. Don't be afraid to start late, to start slow, or to start small. The mountain don't move fast, and yet it never stops rising. Neither should you." When he finished, he folded the pages neatly and sent them off. Clara kissed him on the cheek and said, "Sounds like a goodbye." He shook his head. "Just a thank you." Later that year, the townsfolk held a small festival to celebrate Willow Bend's centennial. They invited Cole to speak as the town's oldest resident. He stood under a wooden arch decorated with flowers, looking out at generations of families, faces new and old, laughter mingling in the air. "I reckon," he began, "if there's one thing this town's taught me, it's that life's a circle, not a straight trail. We start, we wander, we come home, and if we're lucky, we leave the trail a little kinder than we found it." The crowd cheered. Children waved small flags, and someone started playing a fiddle tune. Cole danced a slow step with Clara, her head resting against his shoulder. "Still got your boots," she teased. "Still got you," he replied. That night he sat on the porch long after everyone had gone to bed. The moon was bright, the crickets singing. He opened his old journal, the same one he carried all those years, and found there were still a few blank pages left. He smiled. "Guess the story ain't done yet." He wrote until the candle burned low. Small moments, faces, places, bits of memory. When he was done, he signed his name one last time and closed the book gently. The wind came down from the mountains, soft as breath, carrying the scent of pine and snow. Cole leaned back, looked up at the stars, and whispered, "Thank you for letting me listen." And for the first time in a long while, the night itself seemed to answer back. Morning came quiet and golden. The light spilled across the valley like a gentle wave, brushing the tops of the pines, touching the roof of the Tanner cabin, and finding Cole where he sat still on the porch, the same chair he'd carved himself decades before. His hat rested on his knee, his journal open, though his pen hadn't moved in some time. Inside, Clara stirred, humming softly as she always did when she cooked. The smell of biscuits drifted through the door. Cole smiled faintly, feeling that deep warmth that only comes from years well lived and well loved. He rose slowly, joints creaking like old wood, and walked to the edge of the porch. From there he could see the entire valley, green and endless, with the river glinting in the sun. The mountains stood tall, the same as they always had, silent witnesses to every joy and sorrow he'd carried. He took a long breath and whispered, "Still here." The wind swept through the grass, bending it in graceful waves, as if nodding back. That day, a letter arrived, addressed to both him and Clara. It came from a young teacher named Samuel, one of the children who'd once run barefoot through Willow Bend's dusty roads. He'd grown up reading Cole's books and now taught literature at a small college in Montana. The letter read, "Mr. and Mrs. Tanner, I wanted to thank you for showing me what listening really means. I tell my students your stories every spring. Some think they're about cowboys. I tell them they're about courage, the kind that stays. You taught us all that stillness can be strength." Clara read it aloud, and Cole's eyes grew moist. "Sounds like that boy found his trail," he murmured. She smiled. "Sounds like you helped him find it." They spent that afternoon in the garden, pulling weeds and laughing about old times. A few neighbors stopped by with pie and stories. One little girl brought a drawing of the mountains, scrawled in crayon. "That's you, Mr. Tanner," she said, pointing to a small figure on a horse. "You're the man who listens to the wind." He chuckled softly. "Reckon that's about right." That evening, the sky turned the color of honey and fire. Cole and Clara sat together on the porch swing, hands entwined. He told her about the first time he'd ever seen these mountains, how small he'd felt, how lost. "Back then," he said, "I thought peace meant reaching the end of the road. Turns out it was the walking that mattered all along." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "You always did have a way with words, maybe, but I think I just finally listened hard enough." The air cooled, and the stars began to appear. A single shooting star streaked across the darkening sky, and Clara whispered, "Make a wish." "I already got mine," he said, smiling. They sat in silence for a long time, the kind of silence that feels alive, full of shared memories, laughter, tears, and years that pass too quickly. When the lanterns burned low, Cole rose, kissed her forehead, and said, "I'll be right back." He stepped down into the yard and walked toward the ridge, the same one he'd visited countless times before. The grass glowed faintly in the moonlight, and the wind moved through it like a soft song. He reached the old oak tree where his initials were carved beside his brother's. Kneeling down, he placed his hand over the faded letters. "You can rest easy now, brother," he whispered. "We made it home." He stayed there for a long while, eyes on the horizon, until dawn began to touch the peaks. The colors spilled over the valley, soft and sacred. When he returned to the cabin, the first rays of sunlight were sliding across the porch. He paused, looking at the door, listening. Clara was humming again, the same tune she'd hummed every morning for years. Cole smiled, stepped inside, and joined her for breakfast. Days turned into weeks, and the summer passed gently. Cole's health began to wane, slow and steady, like the dimming of a lantern at dusk. The doctor came often, kind and careful, though Cole always brushed him off. "Don't worry about me," he'd say. "Ain't nothin' wrong that rest won't fix." But Clara knew. She could see it in his eyes, the faraway look of a man whose trail was winding toward its last bend. One night, she asked softly, "Are you afraid?" He smiled faintly. "Not anymore. I've seen the world from the saddle, from the ground, from the stillness. Every part had something to teach. If this is the end, it's just another lesson, waitin'." The next morning, Cole woke early. The sky was clear, The world bathed in soft gold. He dressed, put on his hat, and stepped out to the porch one last time. The mountains stood tall, silent, and familiar. He whispered to them, "You've been good company." Then, sitting in his old chair, he opened his journal again. The final page waited. He wrote slowly, each word steady, sure. The trail never really ends. It just turns quiet. And if you listen close enough, you'll hear the wind say your name. Not as a goodbye, but as a welcome home. He set the pen down, leaned back, and closed his eyes. The wind picked up, moving through the valley in a long, soft sigh. When Clara came out a few minutes later with 2 cups of coffee, she found him there, peaceful and still, the morning light warm on his face. She sat beside him, took his hand, and whispered, "You found your peace, cowboy." The wind moved gently through the grass again, carrying the whisper of his voice somewhere beyond. Years later, Willow Bend built a small library. At the center stood a wooden shelf labeled the Tanner Collection. Inside were all his books, his letters, and his journal, donated by Clara before she passed. Travelers still visit the valley, and sometimes, if they arrive early enough, they say the wind carries a faint sound from the ridge, soft music, like a harmonica playing far away. Children grow up hearing his story. Teachers tell them he was the man who listened so well that even silence spoke back. And on quiet evenings, when the light fades and the stars rise, people still sit on their porches and whisper the same words he once wrote. The trail never ends. It just grows quiet.